My slide presentation in front of you. Before we get started, though, I'd like to thank the participation we have with the House Appropriations Committee and on Senate Finance, working with Ann Oman and her team, and also April Keys and her team. It's been a collaborative effort, and I really do appreciate very much the opportunity to be in front of you today. If you'll move to the next slide, we'll get right in. Let's see, you've got, I think you've got Dan Timberlake's slides up. It's the presentation before that one. Should be review for general fund revenues. That's still the wrong slide deck. It's the one for the revenue slide. Yeah, the title of it is Review of General Fund Revenues for the Virginia Economy for Fiscal. There we go. Okay, got it. Yeah, okay, thank you. If you'll go to the next slide, please. What I'd like to do is to go through three things today to add to the governor's comments. First of all, the fiscal year 2020 year in review. Take a little bit about what happened there and how that may help us decide in making decisions into the future. Then we'll take a look at the changes in the biennium budget for 21 and 22, and even look forward more than that, looking at what might happen as we go out into the future related to our economy, particularly as it relates to our revenue base. So next slide, please. So first, let's start with how the Virginia economy has done compared to the national economy. And I'll look at, as the governor mentioned, both the national economy and the Virginia economy were very strong going into this pandemic here in the early spring. In fact, we were on target to not only make our revenue budget, but probably exceed it. In fact, as you recall, in the General Assembly session this past January, that we added almost $300 million because our revenues were going well in that. But of course, that all changed as we hit into the pandemic and the closing of some of our economy. And I'll just point out to you just a very important, I think, piece of information on this slide. And if you go down to the employment line, as you can see for 2020, the forecast for the U.S. economy was to grow at 1.2%. And then it shows that it decreased 2%. Now, if you go down and look at Virginia and the unemployment line, we were supposed to grow slightly less in employment than the national. But as you see, that what happened with the face of this pandemic, we actually went down less. We performed better than the national economy. And I think that is indicative of a trait that's been going on in Virginia for a long time. And that is sometimes in economic expansion, we tend to trail a little bit the national economy. But when things turn down, we tend to do better. And a lot of that has to do with the makeup of our economy, certainly our reliance on defense spending and the federal government actions, but also I think a lot to do with the mix of our economy. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. So you go to the next slide, please. Here is the story. This has been in the newspapers, and you heard the governor mention we ended up around $234 million below our forecast for the year. When you throw in transfers, a little less than that at $232 million. Now, as the governor mentioned, this was a 2% increase over the last year. It was actually about $430 million over the previous year, about 2%. But it was not as bad as we thought it was going to happen. You remember back in March of this previous year, when you guys were finishing up the regular session and the pandemic was hitting, we estimated that we thought we could lose as much as $1 billion in our fourth quarter, that is April through June, because of the impacts of this virus and the immediate shutdown of our economy. Now, we didn't just pull that number out of the air. We went back and looked at our moderate recession forecast from the previous year, which indicated could be as much as $1 billion. And while we didn't have all the facts, at least it gave us some indication of where we thought we might be headed. But as it turned out, we didn't end up being that much down. We were only down about $230 million, as I mentioned, which means that was about $750 million better than we expected. And again, we'll get into the details of why that happened as we go forward. So if you go to the next slide. Certainly one of the things that cushioned us as we went into this had to do with our strong economy going into it, and also the fiscal and monetary actions taken by the federal government. And if you look at this slide, I'll just draw your attention to the months of April, May, and June. You can see in April and May we were down significantly as the COVID impact shutdowns first started happening. But we increased significantly in June. Now, a lot of that also had to do with changing the tax due date for Virginia taxes from May 1st to June 1st. And as you recall, the federal government moved that date into July. There was a whole lot of uncertainty regarding around this, so we didn't know how Virginia consumers might act, or Virginia taxpayers, because of all this uncertainty and the movement of the tax deadlines. And I'll point out on the federal level, we know that gross domestic product shrunk 32.9%, almost 33% in the final quarter of our fiscal year, that is April through June, which is the sharpest decline on record. Now, the good news to that is it appears that the bottom of this was sometime in late April or early May, and we hopefully will continue on this forecast. But again, just want to point out here that much like the national economy, we experienced pretty significant declines in the fourth quarter, just not as much as we anticipated. So next slide, please. Probably this is no more evident than if you look at growth in withholding tax collections, or our major revenue source in the Commonwealth. Now, I mentioned that federal and monetary stimulus helped cushion this blow. In fact, over $5 trillion were pumped into the economy during April through June of this past year. And we had anecdotal evidence that this was helping our employers, but then this weekend, Barron's had an article that really put it in perspective, at least for me. During the quarter, on a national perspective, we had a $680 billion decline in wages and salaries. We had a $174 billion decline in other income, meaning we had $854 billion decline related to personal income and people having wages to deal with. However, during that same period, $2.24 trillion of transfer payments, that is stimulus checks and unemployment benefits, were pumped into the economy, meaning that we had almost a $1.4 trillion increase during a quarter because of the monetary and fiscal policies taken by the Fed. And that certainly helped cushion our impacts here in the Commonwealth, both in terms of keeping people employed and also people continuing to spend. But you can see, as this chart points out again, I'll point your attention to April, May, and June. It looks like that in April, May was where the bottom, and then we started climbing out of this. So certainly the federal actions have helped cushion the blow to the Commonwealth of Virginia. If you look at the next page, please. We started out looking at the breakdown of the employers here in the Commonwealth and those that might be impacted. This graph just breaks out for you those services. The top part of the graph is the large taxpayers in the Commonwealth. Those that make payments in withholding of over $100,000 every time they pay us monies. And you can see they add up to about 45% of all the people that pay us. And if you go to the right hand of the column, they were only down about less than 0.5%. The small payers in the economy were down 3.4% during April, May, and June. And that makes sense based on what has happened not only in the national economy, but the makeup of our economy here in Virginia. In fact, the large payers are the federal government, our defense spending industry, meaning the shipyards and Hampton Roads, our technology companies, the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Microns, the Microsofts that are out there, and the essential industries that remained open during this, like the food industries, the large retailers. What got hurt during all this, and we certainly need to help them recover, are more small businesses, those in the leisure industry, those in lodging, meals, restaurants, and certainly this may have impacted some of our rural areas a little bit more. But in terms of our revenue base, let's go to the next slide, please. Those large companies are really what drive payroll, withholding, and revenue here in the Commonwealth. This slide just depicts, if you look at those employers that have $3 million or less in payroll, an annual payroll, they make up about 95% of the businesses in the Commonwealth. We have about 250,000 businesses that periodically pay us payroll withholding. And even though they make up, 95% of the entities or the number of businesses, they only represent about 24% of the people that actually pay us for our revenues. So the good news is those large employers remained open, and in fact, some actually added jobs during this past, the last quarter in the year that helped underpin our revenues from payroll withholding. And if you look at those items highlighted in yellow, and you go across to the largest employers in the Commonwealth, that top 1%, which is about 1,300 companies, they pay us over 50% of our payroll withholding. And you can see April through May, they were only down 1.6% and actually were up in June and July. So they very much help cushion the blow that we could have expected that may have come from the closure of businesses. Now, obviously, the payroll protection plan here, again, helped a lot of these employers keep people on the payroll during this period. So I point this out because continued fiscal stimulus may be an indication for us, or monetary stimulus from the feds, an indication to us about how our revenues may be in the future. So next slide, please. This same phenomenon continued when you look at our sales taxes that happened in the last quarter. They were down, but not as much as we anticipated. Now, the governor mentioned that cash is king, and that is what our consumers in the state of Virginia were doing. In fact, if you look at the national level, even though sales were down, credit cards reduced borrowing by $106 billion in the last 3 months of the year. So the consumers took all that money they were getting through the transfer payments and paid down debts. They also continued to spend a little bit during that period and helped cushion some of the blow in our revenues related to sales taxes. I will point out, though, that I believe our localities have been hit harder than the state because of the nature of the shutdowns in the restaurant and leisure industries have impacted probably Main Street much more so, our localities, than the state has felt this. And another reason why we have performed a little bit better than we thought in this particular area is because of the Wayfair legislation that you guys passed over a year ago that allow us to tax internet sales. And if you move to the next slide, this pretty much shows, again, the trend here of those businesses that remained seeing good sales growth. And again, a lot of that was in the areas that were not impacted as significantly in this shutdown. And in fact, if you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see our large payers in just traditional sales tax was down 3.6%. But in use tax, that is internet sales, they were up 57.5%. So what this pandemic has done is accelerated a trend to online sales, something that was already happening, but has helped to accelerate it as people adjust their lifestyle to the ongoing issues related to what they believe their personal health. Next slide, please. But really, the story for the last fiscal year had to do with our most volatile revenue source, and that is non-withholding tax collections. These are the payments that people made to the state for prior year taxes and estimated payments for this coming year, what they believe what their income will be. As you recall, we did move the tax filing deadline from May 1st to June 1st, and so there was a lot of uncertainty as to how this was going to play itself out. The red stars you see on this graph are what our original projections showed we thought the withholding money would come in. That is, in April, we thought we would get a great deal of money because April 1st is normally when taxes are due in Virginia. But of course, it was moved to May 1st. So if you look at those three stars, we anticipated a lot in April and very little coming in over the last 2 months. But it was almost completely reversed. And here is the real thing that made the fourth quarter of last year, we did better than we projected. Our original budget for non-withholding in this quarter, we expected to receive about $1.9 billion in taxes for this revenue source. We actually received $1.9 billion and 70,000. So we made the revenue source in this category, which again, looking back when we were first entering this back in March, it would not have been, I don't think many people would have said that would have been the case based on the quick turn down and shutdown of our economy. But I want to again thank the CPA industry and our taxpayers across the Commonwealth. I know it was confusion, but this revenue source was what helped make the Commonwealth almost make its projections for the past fiscal year. And in fact, if you go to the next page, you can see it always comes down to about 12 or 1,300 large taxpayers. Remember, we were concerned about this revenue source because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of the federal level the previous year and how that impacted us, whether or not those revenues would continue. And as we can see, they did, which is unusual for the Commonwealth in the second year of a major tax policy change. That has not been our history. But again, we'll just point out here, this is the main reason why our revenues were as strong as they were in the fourth quarter. Notwithstanding, we were helped by other factors in those other two revenue sources of sales tax and payroll withholding. Okay, next slide. I just put this in here. This deals with corporate income taxes. Just want to point out how up and down that would be, has been our history if you look back over. I cannot give you a prediction of where corporate income taxes will go this year. That depends on corporate profits. And they, like the state, don't have a clear picture of eventually where they're going to end up. But I just want to put in here that we do continue to track this. And again, to make the point that many of these businesses we need to help get back on their feet because of the impacts of the pandemic. Okay, that wraps up how we ended the last year, and that put us in a very good position in terms of entering the new biennium and looking at our forecast. So if you go to the next slide, please. Let's see here. Yes. On the cash position here, one of the things that the governor mentioned is that cash is king. And so that has been a primary objective that we have been looking at, our cash balances over the last few weeks, a few months on a weekly basis. And I wanted to point out here, not only do we end the year with a pretty good cash balance, but those highlighted items, those arrows, reflect the monies in our reserve funds. We have a little over $1.1 billion in our reserve funds, $635 million or so in the rainy day fund, and about $513 million in the cash reserves. Now, This is not where we'd wanted to be. As you recall, we had projected to be at the end of this next budget. We'd hoped to get close to $2 billion. But part of the unallotment in our strategy to conserve cash was $600 million that was slated to go into reserves in last fiscal year. We did not put in there, not knowing where we were going to end the year and if we needed that for cash. And there was approximately $300 million in 2021 that we unallotted and did not put those into reserves. So if you're thinking back about where we were headed, that's the difference between the 1.1 and the roughly $2 billion that we had anticipated. Some of that money that we were going to put in reserves does remain on our balance sheet, and Dan Timberlake will talk a little bit about that more as we go later. But I wanted to point out, again, one of our objectives was to maintain our cash position, and we've been successful in doing so. And that sets us up for going into the next biennium. Next slide, please. This slide talks about the revenue forecast the governor mentioned that we've gone through over the last several weeks. I'll point out here that, again, we knew it was important to wait to do this forecast so we got the history of how our revenues were being impacted. Otherwise, it would have been a forecast based on sheer uncertainty, and I'm certain that it would have been much more significantly down than what we've been able to go through looking at how our economy has been impacted by this shutdown. I'll just point out here, it is not a forecast of just the governor and his team. It is a forecast put together in collaboration with economists from across the Commonwealth. They come in. We have the business leaders come in across the Commonwealth and give us input into this. Certainly members of the money committees are involved in this forecast and other members of leadership. So we put that all in, and that's how we come up with a collaborative consensus. This just details a little bit of the history about that. But there are three people that I really look to, three economists that I look at that I think know Virginia very well, that tend to temper my thinking of how we may be going and how we're doing. First is Tom Barkin, who is the federal chair here in Richmond. Chris Chimera, who's been following Virginia economics for many years, and Mark Zandi. All three of those recommended the standard position, which again, are the standard forecast, which is a recessionary forecast, but based on primarily how Virginia is being impacted by these revenues. So if you go to the next page here, I'll call your attention to unemployment again, or employment, excuse me, the blue line under to the right of the path. As you can see, in the U.S., in 20, it experienced a 2% decline. In 21, experiencing a 3% decline, and then going back up to over 5% in 2022. Virginia was following that, but not quite as far down as the national economy, because we now know how the Virginia economy is going to respond. So this is a recessionary forecast with a recovery phase that doesn't really start taking effect until pretty much sometime in late 21. And you can see, even when it does, we're not expecting us to increase as quickly as the national economy, and that again has been our tradition and our history as we look at these forecasts. So I just wanted to point that out. We have information from how we've actually responded, and that has been used to help us take a look at where we might go into the future. I will caution, though, that certainly there still remains some uncertainty and risk in this forecast, but I will also say we have a better way to measure that and as we go forward. So next page, please. This really then gets into the details of the governor's forecast, where we mentioned we were going to be down approximately $2.7 billion over the next year. If you go to the total revenue line in the third column that says change, you'll see that in the fiscal year 2021, we'll be down about $1.334 billion. And in looking up above, you can see it's in our primary revenue sources of withholding taxes, payroll withholding taxes, non-withholding, and sales taxes. We all expect those to have a fairly significant decline in this year as we move forward. Next page, please. This is the second year of the forecast, and in this particular forecast, we're expecting to be $1.352 billion down. And again, it's those three same major revenue sources that we expect to be down. So I do believe that, again, there is plenty of pessimism in this forecast. It is not a forecast for a total collapse of either the national or Virginia economy. And I think that is warranted based on looking at how we've actually trended during this particular time. So that is how the forecast looks and the various revenue sources as we move through the next biennium. Next page, please. However, our non-general funds are also impacted. What I've been speaking about up until this point has been the general fund forecast, but our non-general funds, particularly our Commonwealth Transportation Fund, those things needed to fund transportation investments, they've been impacted also. This is a breakdown of the past fiscal year that ended June 30th, and we were down $121 million short of forecast. Obviously, that makes sense as people lessen their driving and certainly for a time stop buying motor vehicles, although that appears to be coming back as we get into the next year. Next page, please. This is a look at the forecast for the next 2 years, and you can see about $750 million down as we look at transportation revenues over the next 2 years. I know there's some language in the budget that Secretary Valentine is looking at to see how we can use our cash balance to help compensate for this some in the first years. But certainly the transportation team will be dealing with some reduced